So let's talk about product launches, right? So this is something that I think everybody's had experience with. And when I think product launch, I think of a big corporate event with a lot of spending in a hotel ballroom, maybe some confetti. Yeah, but I think that there's a version of product launch that goes on in small companies. And what we do there is we whittle down the hotel ballroom and we whittle down the confetti to what is basically going to get our products to market without a lot of extra cost. And so, what are the big challenges that you see small companies having with doing product launch?
Probably the biggest challenge is doing it badly.
Maybe that's not so bad because if the standard is doing it badly, then at least you're in good company, right?
But it's expensive. And the biggest issue that I see is basically not starting to think about the problem until you're ready to launch the product. And companies tend to be so product focused and they tend to be so focused on their product development efforts that everything is really around polishing up this product. And they want the perfect thing before they go to market, so that the thing that I always hear is you can't make a second first impression. And and I think that there's way too much focus on polishing that up. I think almost every company that I've worked with could easily have gone to market a year earlier than they did. And that has real impact in terms of your need for outside capital, your need to give up equity, and your ability to start generating revenue. But the bigger issue is simply not understanding that your product launch starts 12 to 18 months before the product's ready to be launched. And and the long-term success of that product is really dependent almost exclusively on what you do on the 12 months on either side of the product launch. So you've got about a 24-month window, 12 before, 12 after, to get it right. And it can often be hard to recover longer term. And so you see these products that are zombie products, that they're out there in the market. There's some trickle of revenue from it, but you're not really getting the kind of acceleration and the kind of revenue growth that you should be able to. And and a lot of this comes from, again, what you're doing early on. And there are a number of key issues. One that I always point out is that you have to be telling people about what's coming before it's ready. And you look at marketing for movie productions. Almost all of marketing for every movie you've ever seen occurred before you could buy the product, because otherwise the movies would be opening to completely empty theaters for the first month. And your product is no different than that. You really have to be able to let people know, so that there's some awareness and potentially even anticipation, so that when you do have the product ready to go to market, you've got some back pressure in terms of demand, so that when your salespeople go out and start to try to talk about the product, there's awareness, there's already some interest, and there's already potentially some latent demand. Plus, the other advantage to doing this is that if you've got competitors who are already in the market, then if people know that your product is coming and it looks good or better than a competitor, you can freeze the competitor out of the market. You can get people to postpone buying someone else's product until they get a chance to see yours. And there's
Right.
enormous value in that.
So we covered that previously when we were talking about marketing, you starting your marketing well in advance of sales and working that into your budgets. And you covered a lot of ground there. So I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier, which is understanding the problem and making sure that the product that we're designing and plan to sell is actually going to be a fit for the customer's problem. So that's essentially a market research challenge, right? So what inventors and the people that go before VCs to get funding hopefully don't come up with this stuff just purely in their imagination. It's based on some real world experience that's given them the idea, and they've making a device or a kit or something that's going to solve that particular scientific challenge. Where does it start to go off the rails there?
So one of the things that you need to understand is, I guess, one, there's the question of, is there the potential that the market will accept this product? Is it enough different, enough better than what's already out there, that you're going to start to be able to peel people away from alternative solutions? To a certain extent, that's the only question you really need to answer in the early stages of a company to get funding, to begin to do the product development work. But when you're getting down to the point where you're trying to sell the product, You don't sell it to a market, you sell it to individuals. And who are these people you're going to sell it to? Where are they? What are they buying right now? Do they know you exist? And where are they in terms of where can you go to reach them? And one of the things that I've seen more than once are companies that have spent years and millions invested in product development. They go to launch and they literally spend the first year selling to people who are not buyers because they didn't do the research about who actually is going to use and buy this product. And this is an extraordinarily expensive problem because not only are you generally expecting revenue in that first year or two, but you're cranking up the spending on your sales effort as well as your marketing effort. And if you are knocking on the wrong doors, if you're literally selling to the wrong people, this is a huge problem. And this is an area that I see probably more common in clinical diagnostics than in research tools. Because I think in research tools, these are mostly scientists from the lab that are creating these companies. And so they've got an intuitive sense of who will buy the product and how they'll use it. But if it's a scientist out of an academic facility that's now going to produce a product that's going to be sold into the clinical environment, it's a very foreign world. And so it's easy to make naive assumptions about a certain type of specialist is going to be treating this sort of condition. And the deal is you can't make those assumptions. And the answers are very easy. You can get access to things like reimbursement databases. So you can actually see of patients with the condition that your product is associated with, who are the types of physicians who are actually submitting reimbursement for treating those patients.
Right. So clinical utility, that's a big one. And even so, I worked for a company that they had a chief medical officer, they had a scientific advisory board that was full of the right kind of doctors. And I literally took this product to every physician in my territory. And from an astounding number, a majority of them, I heard the response, there's no clinical utility for this product. It's got analytical validity, it's got clinical validity, but it has no clinical utility. And we can dive into those distinctions at a later date, maybe. But I think where I saw this company making their mistake is the sample that they're looking at for their market research is their founder and their scientific advisory board. And it's not a random sample of community physicians that are actually going to have to use the product. There is a small minority of people that thought, hey, this is good science and it might tell us something prognostically. But you take it out to the broader community of physicians in that case, and there was really, that message didn't resonate at all. So how can you avoid getting into a situation like that where you're getting confirmation bias the more you study your market?
Probably the best tool for that are customer panels. And so these are people that you identify in the market that are likely buyers. Now, again, you first have to ask the question and answer the question, who's actually going to use a thing like what I've got? So again, you go back to things like the reimbursement databases to see the physicians that are treating patients with these codes, that are using these diagnostic codes. What do these physicians look? Once you've identified that, then what you want to do is to set up what are essentially in the consumer product world is called a customer panel, which is a list of people who represent primarily potential future buyers. If you've been in business 10 years, I think you still could use the information from a customer panel. But what a lot of companies will do is they'll start with their existing customers, which is a very biased set.
Yeah.
What you want are people who don't know you exist or who barely know you exist.
Right.
And what you need, what these customer panels are doing is they're essentially a mechanism to do structured interviews with potential future buyers. And what you're looking for is a sense of why they're going to buy, how they're going to look at you compared to their existing options, because no one buys in isolation. They always buy in terms of what's the relative benefit compared to all of my other available options. And then the other thing that's very critical is understanding the language they use, because your sales and your marketing really need to be built on a backbone of taking the language that the customers use to talk about their problem that you solve and feeding that language directly back to them. because that's the language that they're going to understand and that they're going to resonate with. And if your marketing does not include that language, it's going to fail.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think every episode we do for 20 minutes, in 20 minutes, we can come up with a full-time job description for a whole another full-time employee. And market research to me feels like one of those, because most people have, it's a specialized role even within marketing. Like you go to any corporate marketing department and the number of people there that are experienced and more or less qualified to run a robust marketing study are not very common. And so it's the sort of specialized skill set that you don't really get if you're a group of founders or early employees at a small company. And on top of that, let's say you have somebody that's willing to tackle that issue, experience or not, it's hard to do this, right? It's going to cost you some money.
But it's faster and cheaper than people imagine, and especially for a B2B product. It's one thing to be selling shampoo, where your market is 5 billion people. Most of the products in biotech, you've got a relatively small market. And again, market research is essentially sampling a population to be able to draw inferences from the sample back to the full population. And the thing I always say about market research is it's like going to the doctor for a blood test. They don't need to draw 5 liters of blood. A cc or 2 will do. So you don't need huge sample sizes. And so typically when I've run these customer panels, I've often have knocked this out in 2 to 4 weeks. And usually it involves between 8 to 12 one-on-one interviews. Now there's some lead-in processes because you need to identify your target market that you're trying to reach out to. You need to qualify people in that market to be able to be selected into the panel. You need to then pull people into the panel. And then you need to go through and you do the one-on-one interviews. This is a quick, cheap, it's not inexpensive, but it's not a terribly expensive or difficult process. And I would say I've often have been able to complete these in 2 to 4 weeks.
Right. So on the sales side, I look at trade-offs, right? So if you don't do enough or robust enough market research, how many months of missed sales is that going to cost you? That's what you want to look at, I think, because if you can get the right research and be able to launch with the right message to the right people, you're going to save yourself a lot of effort. And these are typically the clients that come to me as an independent sales rep. Many of them have not done very robust market research. It's been a one-on-one interview with 3 people, maybe. That's the sum total of their market research. And then I have to engage in a process where I'm doing the messaging and finding the people by trial and error. Like, what channel can we reach them through? What messages are they going to respond to? What does the value proposition look like through their eyes? So I think and when I think about, again, market research, I'm thinking 5 to sometimes 6 figures for a particular study, because you have to spend the time to do it. And you have to, a lot of times, pay the panel participants to do it. And then time and effort has to go into the analysis and the follow-up. But where I sit, I see that as a worthwhile trade-off. If you can save 6 months of having somebody like myself beat the street to figure out where your product fits, I think that's money well spent.
And the other thing is that it makes not only the money that you spend on the sales side, but the money you spend on the marketing side, it enhances the effectiveness of it. And I'll give you a specific example. One of the things you typically want to do after launch is to shift your marketing away from letting people know it's coming to trying to rapidly identify people who have a need right now, who are in market for this product, so that you can then begin to direct those leads to your salespeople and hopefully generate revenue with it. One of the primary tools for doing this is search marketing, search ads. So you do paid search ads. If you've run these customer panels and you have a lexicon of words and phrases that the customers are using as they talk about the problem, and you incorporate that back into the structure of the wording of your Google search ads, I have seen 5, 10, and even 20-fold increases, not percent, 20-fold increases in response rate. Because again, people are in a hurry. They're searching. If they see the exact phrase that's in their head, the exact thing that they're looking for, it's much more likely to stop them and get them to click through and take a look at you.
Yeah.
And this initial primary market research is essentially a nonlinear amplifier of the efficiency of all of your marketing and all of your sales efforts that occur downstream of that.
So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to something else that you mentioned. I want to take it apart a little bit. So I think if we understand the product, the problem that our product is trying to fit into and solve, and if we understand the right people to go after, that is two legs of the stool. I think the how do you go after them and what channels are they going to be responsive in is I rarely see any data or even interview level data that is actionable for a company to decide, hey, we're going to invest in this channel or this event or this particular social media platform. Have you seen companies engage with that? Is that what's the relative value of that kind of information compared to research about value proposition or customer buyer type?
I think you've got to know who you're selling to, but you have to know where they're going, where they're getting information. And sometimes this is quite surprising. So for instance, if you look at physicians, if you're selling a diagnostic product to physicians, you're going to have a hard time getting a salesperson face to face. They tend, especially in the current era, especially in the US, physician schedules are, heavily and largely out of their control. So they don't have a lot of downtime during the day to scrolling Facebook
or to talk with sales reps.
And some of the work I've done on the clinical diagnostic side around the customer panels and the customer interviews is asking them specifically about where they get information about new products, where they go to keep themselves up to speed. And sometimes it's surprising. One of the major avenues turns out to be CME classes. So the continuing medical education classes. Every physician is required to have a certain number of credits each year. There's a lot of these that are online. There's a lot that are done as almost like little mini conventions. And in many cases, there are very good opportunities to get advertising in front of them to at least let them know you exist.
I got a better idea. Instead of advertising, why don't we just co-opt the whole program and set up our own CME program?
You can do that, but it's expensive.
Yeah.
And because the classes have to have their own certification. And so it's a lengthy, difficult process. What you can do actually is to create a CME class and have it hosted by an existing purveyor of CME classes.
Yeah.
And
if that CME provider just so happens to be getting like 90% of their revenue from you, that's a situation I've run up against. And so that to me, that's the other side of the sword, is that if you want to play in that space, there's entrenched competitors, and the CME providers are quite sensitive to who's funding them, right? So if you have a competitor and you're trying to go head to head against that competitor in a particular CME forum, you might strike out.
But the challenge is, in an increasingly kind of oversubscribed world, how do you reach these people?
Yeah.
And where do they turn? The other thing is that they will often have very obscure, very small circulation, sort of specialty trade publications that will be unique to their specialty. And again, there's an opportunity to get in front of them there. But it's a challenge for research scientists in the lab. It's going to be a different set of forums that you're going to reach them through. There, I think in some ways, a researcher is far easier to get in front of than a physician.
Yes. The challenge on the research side, the distinction I would draw is that they have so much data and so many different things that they're interested in and want to look at, and that cross their desk. And I think it's very open-ended compared to the clinical world, which I tend to think of as more of a closed circle in terms of, if it's not in a clinical trial, it's not going to enter the decision-making set for a physician, typically, that sort of thing.
Right. Or what I refer to as the shiny squirrel problem.
Yeah. So in research, it's like you are one show on Netflix, and Netflix has like 1 million shows now. Right. And so if you hit the algorithm and you show up on people's feed, then you're going to get the attention. But that, I think between research and clinical, you're right to draw the distinction. They're very different environments to work in.
So one of the things I think we should throw out is the role of KOLs around product launch. And my experience has been they're not that useful. And they're not that useful for a couple of reasons. One, they tend to give you really terrible advice about how people are buying things right now today, because they haven't been that person in 10 or 20 or 30 years. So a typical KOL is some very old, usually guy, that is running a big department, a large research institute. They are not seeing physicians. They are not at a lab bench holding a pipetter. They do not understand anything typically about how people in the trenches are thinking about their problems, talking about their problems, or looking for solutions to their problems. And I've seen KOLs really drive companies off a cliff because the founders would listen to the KOL and believe what they said and not validate it. And what they said was fabulous advice if it was 1995 still. Sadly, it's not. And the other issue is that if you've got some very obscure KOL, they will have the sort of time and energy and bandwidth to talk about your stuff to people. But the problem with that is if it's an obscure KOL, it's not much of a KOL because the KOL is someone with high visibility and a large audience. If you look at these KOLs, many of them are on dozens of SABs.
They're in the KOL business.
They are in the KOL business. And the problem is, the problem with sort of a true KOL is the same problem with trying to rely on that sales rep from Thermo Fisher to sell your stuff that has 80,000 SKUs in the catalog to sell, that the chance that you are going to be the most attractive thing for them to talk about today is very thin.
Yeah.
And so they have value, but they primarily have value as tokens of
credibility.
Yeah, credibility, tokens of credibility to place in front of the gods of that they are useful to convince investors that you must be onto something good. They are really not effective as a general rule. Again, there are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, they are the last person you want to turn to try to understand how to sell your product.
I would probably agree with that. I think in terms of what you could do with KOL development, that the sort of KOLs, and we're going to just, the term has just gotten so broad now. The strategies that I've seen work on the research side tend to revolve around actually slightly younger scientists, maybe a younger scientist who had a prestigious mentor and they have this research specialization that fits very well with your product. And simply having them give a couple talks, publish a couple papers, it's not a very intense strategy, but you're basically taking somebody that nobody else really knew and then using the company's resources to promote their work. And then they're on the return path of that, they're promoting your product.
And something useful is to think in terms, not so much scientific advisory board, but a customer advisory board that consists of 5 or 6, again, if you got to say a clinical product, 5 or 6 physicians that are in the core specialties that are going to be your customer base, that are early to mid 30s. They have a very high patient census. They're working to establish themselves in their career, and they're seeing and doing an enormous amount of stuff at this point in their career. And a single individual like that will be able to give you a much better understanding from their direct experience about how the real world is working today. How are you going to fit into the reimbursement process? How are you going to fit into what are the other alternative ways of solving this problem do physicians in the trenches have? And there are similar things on the selling into the research side as well, although in some ways I think that's a bit easier.
Yeah, but everybody says it's easier, and then you do it.
And then very critically, such a group that you could treat them like an SAB, but this is really more like a customer advisory board. This is the place to go to have conversations about how to articulate your clinical utility. Because if you cannot articulate your clinical utility, you will not be able to sell the product. That's an absolute ironclad law. And clinical utility is not your sensitivity, your specificity, your LOD, your unit cost, your turnaround time. None of those have anything to do with clinical utility. Clinical utility is about how you fit into the other available options, and can you deliver something of sufficiently high and unique utility compared to any of the other available options that it will materially change how the physician makes a decision about a patient. And if you cannot put that front and center in your marketing, you're going to have a very hard time getting anyone to pay attention to you.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Sounds good. Until next week.
Next week, Dale.
Goodbye.